oftentimes when you start talking with people who have that functional training, let's call it background, they're generally going to have a conversation to you at some point about how to train the core and the benefits of training that, let's call it rib cage to middle thigh area of the body. I mean, what are some unique approaches that you take to training that area of the body, and we'll call it the core for this conversation, but controlling the body, again, as it relates to movement?
And this is the burning question that always comes up in fitness and sports performance and rehab industries is what is the core? And you identified the rib cage to the mid-thigh, which I agree with, but here's a question. I always refer back to, let's say, an apple. And you look at the apple and you usually have either the red or the green skin on the outside, and you peel that away and you've got the meat on the inside, and you either eat or peel that away. And what do we get to? We get to the center of the core. And everybody identifies the core, which is what we usually throw away. But what happens from the core out to the skin? The point is that it's all connected. And I'm a firm believer that, yes, we've got to get the core in our traditional sense strong, but we typically do that how? Many cases we're still doing it with crunches or curls or whatever from a supine position, laying face up. The problem is that we don't do a whole lot from that position. So now I've got to look back and say, what's the core? And if we look at the fascial connections, what we're seeing is that the core, attaches to the hips. You've got the abdominals attached to the hip flexors, and the hip flexors are right next door neighbors to the adductors, which are connected to the hip flexors by fascia. In fact, the adductors and the hip flexors are connected to the pelvic floor by fascia. You can take those adductors running down the inner part of the leg, and the adductors wrap around to the back, and they connect to the hamstrings by fascia. The adductor even goes down on the side, on the medial side of the knee, connects right next to the calf and the posterior tibialis. It's all connected by fascia. So now we're down into the calf, which goes down into the foot. It's connected by fascia. You can take the great toe, and if you don't have good motion in the great toe, I guarantee you're going to have tightness in the hip flexors and in the abdominals. I've seen it time and time again. In fact, I've worked on in my career, I can think of maybe a half a dozen or so athletes and non-athletes, I think we're all athletes in some phase or another, who have had sports hernia injuries. And every case that I have worked on, within 2 to 3 years prior to their sports hernia injury, they've had either a foot or ankle or great toe problem or injury that became limited in motion, and they never recaptured the full range of motion. I have seen that once we gain that mobility in the foot, ankle, and the great toe, you get better motion through the hip, which now allows all kinds of triplane motions through the core and through the abdominals. I'm a firm believer that the core starts from the floor. And many of the techniques that we'll use, I don't mind doing the crunch if that's what somebody really wants to do. I prefer doing it in an environment such as on a stability ball, and I'll prefer to do that first because I know, generally speaking, sagittal plane dominant. We do a lot of flexion in that movement. But then I want to get them up into an integrated movement such as med ball throws, such as a triangulated shoulder press, such as a staggered stance, and just taking the opposite arm and reaching back and overhead. That's going to allow the abdominals to start playing and moving and eccentrically loading in all three planes of motion. Because when you think about it, Rob, you take a motion such as a pitcher or a baseball player who's throwing a baseball, the abdominals are extended, they're laterally flexed, and then they rotate. And what they have to do is decelerate all those motions first and then harness the energy to get a good forceful throw. So I need to make sure that I have my client working from the ground up when we start looking at the core. But in the case of, for instance, the sports hernia injury, I need to get the mobility in the great toe through the foot, through the ankle. I need to get the mobility through the hip. I need to get the mobility through the thoracic cage. I need to make sure that the shoulder girdle has good mobility because all that passes through the core. So what I have to make sure that we do is go through a remedial movement pattern first, just to sensitize the proprioceptors, just to make sure that we're getting range of motion through the fascia and then the muscles, not the muscles first. But I need to make sure that I'm getting foot and ankle complex, hip, and thoracic spine mobile in all three planes of motion to be able to eccentrically load and then concentrically unload that will affect the abdominals, the obliques, the lats, the quadratus lumborum, the transverse abdominis. All this feeds into the core. That goes up into the pec. That goes up into the shoulder girdle. That all emanates through the arm, the release of a ball as you throw. But it's the core that is so important to transfer forces from the ground up and from the top down, but also to mitigate forces from the ground up and from the top down. So I'm going from an inside-out approach when it comes to training the core muscles.